Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Diligence Tool Provider workshop on data visualization for due diligence tools. My name is Tim Peters. I am a online strategist at Static/The Kind Kids, and I'll be moderating today's session. The question we'll be tackling in the next hour is, okay, you've built a due diligence tool, it's done its job, it's gathered data, assessed risks, produced a result, now what? Because obviously the real challenge isn't generating the data or even showing the data, visualizing the data. It's making sure that the person on the other end actually understands the data and even better, can act upon it, knows what to do next. One could argue that a risk score that gets misread is worse than no score at all. A dashboard that simply overwhelms a user is bound to get ignored, and a report that isn't accessible simply doesn't reach everyone that it should. To help us explore these topics, we have two excellent speakers who approach data visualization from very different angles. To start us off, we have Thomas Roelens, who is the head of data journalism and visual storytelling at De Tijd, the leading Belgian financial newspaper. And Thomas basically turns complex data into stories people can actually act on. Following his presentation, we will hear from Anton Lecoq. He is my colleague at The Kind Kids, a senior information architect who specializes in building accessible interfaces for impact-driven organizations. Together, they'll share practical principles, common pitfalls, and concrete advice that you can take back to your own tools. Without further ado, let's dive in. But maybe one quick word of sort of housekeeping. We do welcome questions. We want this to be interactive. If you have a burning question on data visualization, we want our experts to weigh in on that. But maybe let's wait. So please add your questions in the chat, and we will handle them at the end of the presentations. All right. Without further ado, Thomas, take it away.
So my name is Thomas. I'm the head of data journalism and digital storytelling at De Tijd. We're a team of 5 people composed of developers, data analysts, and journalists who look into data from all different sort of teams, ranging from government data to company records and so forth. So we don't really have a fixed team of subjects that we work on, but each project is at least a project where we try to tell a story based on quantitative data for which we work together with the experts in our newsroom, but also with like external academia and so forth. The type of stories that we bring have a broad range, starting from very concrete news articles, which have just some supporting graphs, up to full-scale interactive projects and explainers that are completely visually driven. For today, I would like to dive into one specific interactive article that we published last year about the critical raw materials. So critical raw materials has been a subject that was on our radar for quite some time because it touches a lot of economic sectors. It touches both geopolitics as well as pure business and so forth. So a lot comes together in the team. And for us, it was really important to give readers an overview of where do we stand, where do we stand as Europe, where do we stand as Flanders, but also how do you make a very abstract theme as concrete as possible for an average reader. And I think the reason why I will focus today on this project is, of course, thematically, it's very related to the due diligence project, but at the same time, I identified a couple of lessons that could be learned from this project, even in a business-to-business environment, in terms of how do you communicate this type of information. So the takeaway for you guys today will be, how can I make due diligence reporting more relatable, more actionable, and Anton will focus on how to make it also more accessible, but even if those three aspects, in my opinion, are very related to each other. The starting point for us was this study of VITO, which is the Flemish Institute of Technology, supported by the environmental department. But it followed the very typical academic structure, where you had an introduction, context, methodology, then the whole data and evidence, rounded up with the synthesis and references. And although this is a very defendable structure for a paper, I think it, in large terms, it also follows a lot of the structure, a lot of dashboards and a lot of, let's say, web platforms of diligence tools and European communication, where at the beginning you have all the ins and outs of the project, who supports it, who organizes it, and so forth, and then only some way midterm you find the actual data, and even at the end you find the actual takeaways. So I think for us it was really important to step away from that kind of structure and to translate it to a journalistic structure where you have readers who have a very limited time span. I think that goes as well for news readers as for even for professional readers, because even for them, time and let's say attention span will be very limited. And then for us as storytellers, it's very important to look at how can we translate this to a more compelling narrative structure. So a couple of things that I miss a lot of in a lot of papers and in a lot of dashboards and so forth is the main takeaways, or the, let's say, the main goals at the very beginning of the project. Like, why does this matter? How does this impact me? And specifically, why does this matter now? So a good example from the interactive project was even the way how we put the title and the introduction for this type of projects. Actually, I'd say take up quite some time, because we try to balance all the different messages that we try to send at that point. If you look at the introduction, we try to give readers, let's say, we try to connect the dots between all the different geopolitical themes where this topic, the critical raw materials, plays a part. We start the introduction from the trade war between US and China to the conflict in Ukraine and the recent violence in Congo. These were all separate news articles from the past couple of months where we identified as critical raw materials as playing a major role. So even those simple ingredients can already make the difference between a very dry and abstract report and the difference between something that readers are triggered by, can act upon, and are let's say triggered to read further. The second item I wanted to mention as well is we don't only state why this project or why this article would be relevant for readers, but we also very much try to focus on why it is relevant at this specific point in time. Of course, for a journalistic medium, being inside the news cycle and so forth is very important, but I think this also can apply for diligence tools and so forth, where you also have certain deadlines, certain policy-related agendas that play a role and are often lacking in the communication of those tools. If you look at the first couple of paragraphs that we have in the article, I've put them here. A lot of text and a lot of work goes into signaling to the reader why does this play a role now. In our case, it was the combination of clashes in the trade war between the US and China, specific Chinese decisions to further restrict exports of rare earth materials, and the bigger picture, which was actually the recent visit to from the US to China, which then was still due to a couple of months, all played a role in why do we publish this article today. I think for diligence tools, it could also determine the frequency of how you communicate, when you communicate. Let's say if you have important policy deadlines or important policy shifts happening, that all might be specific reasons to communicate rather than just publishing a tool whenever the technical people were ready or whenever the data gets an update, because very often those timings come from a technical or a policy background rather than a news or let's say a real world actionable dates. So that was a point I wanted to add as well. So the structure we built for the interactive was, rather than having an introduction, a methodology, and so forth, we broke down the team in a couple of specific questions. Why do you call it critical materials? What are their applications, sources, European strategy, and which role do we play as Flanders? I think the biggest challenge for us is to bridge all those teams while keeping your narrative structure sharp, while keeping readers engaged, and while balancing the amount of information that we give, while also making it possible for users to get the whole overview, then rather than getting up to chapter 2 and then bouncing off because the text and visualizations were too complicated or too heavy. So for us, it's much more important that we give readers, let's say, an overview of about 8 or 10,000 characters, rather than having the whole study covered and only having a small fraction of our readers reading the whole thing. Then up for visualizations, which of course I have a presentation here, but I will also take you guys to the actual interactive page. So as you see, this starts off as a very classical article where we give the context and the reasons why people should worry about this team for now. But then also very quickly, we after the breakdown of the specific teams, we give people an introduction visualization. I think if we would have developed this a couple of years ago, then this would be the main piece of our interactive. So here you have the periodic table where you get all the chemical elements, and we will give you guys a breakdown of which elements are relevant in the whole discussion of critical raw materials. I think a couple of years ago, we would have developed something like this, and then allowing people to hover over these elements and giving them, let's say, self-control over which are the purposes of each of these elements. I think that's kind of a transition we made a couple of years ago, where we stepped away from having classical dashboards that allow readers to go through the data themselves. And we really took up our role as storytellers in order to guide readers and take them by the hand through this complicated data. Because more and more we start to think about our role, which isn't a statistical office or isn't, let's say, an academic publication, but more and more it's our focus to give readers, let's say, the most important elements of visualization rather than having them look through the whole thing. So in this case, this shows by, if you have the starting visualization, we wrote the text. So each separate step is aligned with the visualization. So we start with a very basic text, which introduces them to the chemical elements. But then we introduce a step where we take an object like a smartphone, and we highlight the elements which were all based on academic studies. We highlight the elements which were actually relevant for, let's say, very daily object like a smartphone. And then we start using that visualization as a vehicle for a story. So rather than having one static dashboard-like or tool-like visualization, we use it as a vehicle, which actually you could tell 1,000 of stories through this visualization. We focus on a couple of them now, but we try to build up the visualization so that readers, even if they don't understand anything of the first step, that step by step we take them through the whole process and give them specific examples, which give more and more detail about specific elements rather than just having the whole thing. And this was, let's say, the introduction that at the same time highlights the complexity of the subject, but at the other hand also tries to trigger them into the whole critical material discussion. So the whole point of using data visualization as a storytelling vehicle for us is really a very important thing and something that comes up throughout the whole project. A second thing as well is that we try to, so as you see, we combine, let's say, classical texts with more visual driven elements. Here also, this was a visualization or a Sankey, a very complex one from JRC. And rather than just reproducing the whole figure, we reproduced the thing, but we only highlight very specific elements. And those elements are really well determined in our storytelling as well. So we really think about, okay, we might not use the whole visualization, but let's say we can tell something about windmills, and then, okay, this specific stream is relevant for us, so we will highlight it, and then maybe we'll add 2 or 3 more steps. We will never give readers the whole overview or the possibility to go through the whole thing, because we really want them to focus on, let's say, the 2 or 3 aspects that are most relevant to our story. Here, the message was that certain technologies are really leaning on one type of rare earths metals, while others combine a lot of different categories of rare earth metals, which can be simply visualized as this. So that was the second very important point where we try to show, don't tell, but really think about the amount of information that you can give in one overview rather than bombarding people with all possible ranges. Lead by argument as well. I think every visualization in this whole in this interactive page was chosen because at that point it felt necessary to give that visualization, and it made sense within the storytelling structure. So first of all, we wrote, let's say, a draft where we had all the storyline that we wanted the story that we wanted to tell, and then in order to support that story, we thought about, okay, how can we visualize each of those points, rather than just producing a whole bunch of visualizations and then thinking about, okay, how can we bring those into a dashboard or into a visual page. In all honesty, of course, the process will be iterative because for sure you need to explore a lot of possibilities before you can actually produce a final article. But I think the main takeaway here is that each visualization serves a very specific purpose in this story and can only serve that purpose at that specific point in the story, rather than just being all over the place and being a bunch of graphs that just need to enrich the article. They very much support the messages that we try to bring. So in this case, we wanted to point out that a lot of countries where Europe has to deal with in order to support or in order to gain those critical raw materials often have a dubious reputation. So we stepped away from the whole veto report here and actually went looking for data about democracy indexes. So something that wasn't completely that was mentioned in the academic study. So the veto study told, okay, for Europe and for Flanders, this will be a hard race in order to get all those necessary critical raw materials, because we will have to deal with a lot of regimes and so forth in order to support ourselves. And so in this case, the visualization builds up to an overview where we have the different countries which we deal with, and then color them by are they authoritarian or full democracies. So that was additional data that we looked up in order to support that message. And then I think in terms of visualization as well, something that I think is something that we try to do a lot of the times is give people a sense of what's behind the data. So we had a list of all the companies that were identified in Flanders that work with critical raw materials. But rather than sticking to a global number of 114 companies are impacted, we try to make it very concrete in terms of contacting specific companies, asking them, okay, how are you guys impacted specifically? How do you guys position yourselves in all these geopolitical shifts that happen in that market? So in this case, we mentioned, or we show one specific company site, only just then to take a step backwards and show all the sites in Flanders that work with critical raw materials. But we could also, I think a couple of years ago, then again, we would have simply published this map and have readers look up or click on specific buttons. While now we try to really use that information as some sort of larger truths coming from a very micro focus, and then taking a step back. So that makes it, I think, much more concrete as well for readers if those dots on a map don't just stay abstract numbers, but if you can really identify specific companies and also tell something about them in this type of interactive visualization. Of course, I know certainly well is this type of digital story may not, it's a very specific type of format, but I think the main takeaways that I mentioned earlier can be applied to static visualizations as well. If I look at a couple of, because we don't only make these type of big projects, but sometimes also do a lot of other stuff. So this was a visualization that we published actually last week, which talks about the automation risk of specific jobs. I think all the lessons that I mentioned earlier also apply here. So we give the graph a very specific title, or a very story-driven title. A third of telecom installers task are at risk of automation. I think a lot of publications would only have the subtitle and make that the actual title. So a lot of publications would only tell, okay, this graph describes this. I think it makes it much more actionable and insightful if you already try to give readers an overview of what's inside the data through the title. So in this case, having a very clear communication point, and at the same time giving readers through the annotations, which in this case are in Dutch, but they just give a couple of highlighted elements or a lot of tasks that show, okay, that this is behind the actual data. Tasks are at risk, could be updating software and so forth. So we give a much more granular overview of the data. Same applies for this, which was a couple of graphs that we published also a couple of weeks ago, just after the whole start of the Iran conflict, where a lot of people We're going to the gas station at the last point before the price hikes. And here again, we try to give a very clear title, which is more, in this case, let's say, a much more literal type of graph. And then the subtitle describes the metadata, as we could tell. But then at the same point, we just don't give the graphs. We try to give some granularity. Okay, this is what's behind the data. We don't give and we don't just give a global average. At the same time, we try to highlight the percentages that are behind the graphs in order to give people a real sense of the data, rather than just keeping it as an abstract thing. So all the lessons of, let's say, an interactive storytelling project or a dashboard and so forth, they all share a bunch of the same lessons, I think, in order to make visualizations more comprehensible, more actionable, and also to make them also communicate much more directly to readers. Voilà. I think that were my main points. Anton will talk also about accessibility of projects, which for me really adds up to this, because accessibility already for us is about how to reach the most broad public as possible with our tools, which could be taken to the next step by also making them more accessible.
Thank you very much, Thomas. You're making my role as moderator very easy because you're right at spot on time. I'm just going to hand it over straight away to Anton, and want to remind everybody that if you have specific questions for either Thomas or Anton, please share them in the chat and we will deal with them after Anton's presentation.
There we go. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Thomas, for the wonderful first part of the presentation. I'm taking over, focusing more on the accessibility part, not just as a visual design question, but also as a question of whether your tool actually reaches everyone it's meant to reach. It's not only about the charts, it's also about the language, the structure, the decisions it helps people make. And that's what I want to talk about today. I'm not a due diligence expert, but I've spent a long time working with users that tools like due diligence tools, but also other tools that they were and weren't built for. And that's the perspective I want to bring today. So again, I'm an information architect and an accessibility advocate. Most of all, I'd like to define myself as a designer with a soft spot for accessible and sustainable interface design, and also what it means to build things that generally work for everyone. I do this at a company called Static. We're part of the Kind Kids. We're a Leuven-based digital agency focused on projects that generally try to move the world forward. We conceive and build digital tools, always with accessibility and sustainable at the core. We are a B Corp since 2021. Where we try to balance profit with positive global impact. The Kind Kids is a collective committed to making the world a better place by pushing forward change makers, pushing forward change-making organizations to let them flourish and help impact-driven organizations grow. In this context of Diligence, Static is also a technical partner of the Diligence project. We've built the platform you've used to sign up for the webinar, for example. So that's a small example of our work. I'll go over three main topics in my presentation. First of all, a short primer on accessibility and why I think it's important. Who is your user really? Let's ask that question. Then 4 main failure modes, 4 main things that happen or that go wrong often with regards to accessibility. And the third part is a takeaway, what you can do already right now, and how you can fix things that might be broken on your tool. On accessibility, people instinctively think of inclusive design for people with a disability when you think about accessibility. So, but accessibility is much more than that. There is no official UN definition, I believe, but you could say that persons with disabilities have the same rights as everyone else. Accessibility is about making everything usable and reachable, but not only for people with a disability or without a disability. Every user deserves equal treatment. And if we go have a look at the figures, the numbers on people with reported disability in the EU, these are numbers from 2024. Nearly 25% of EU citizens over 16 years old report having a disability of some form. That adds up to, I think, more than 90 million people. And these forms of disabilities can be categorized in a variety of ways. For example, sensory impairments related to seeing or hearing, blindness, color blindness, hearing, but also physical disabilities, intellectual related to development or learning, psychosocial related to mental health, and neurological related to the brain or the nervous system. However, I would like to point out that accessible design isn't just about designing for people with permanent disabilities. It's about designing for a full range of human variation, including temporary injuries or situational context. The fixes that I'm going to suggest will help almost definitely. It will almost definitely always benefit the many and not help the few. So it's not necessarily about the person being limited, but oftentimes about the information transfer being limited. Some of those limitations can be temporarily or situational in nature. For example, you can see on the visual here, but other examples could be a slow internet connection because you have an older smartphone, or an unreliable connection where you are at in the train, for example. So a big visual is not loading, or the sun is shining on your screen, so you can barely make out what the text is saying, or it's not contrasting enough, or you're holding a newborn baby in your arms while trying to be productive. Or you're in a noisy place and you can barely hear what's being said on the video, or you lose your voice because of a cold and now you can no longer present a webinar properly. But in the end, it all worked out and I got my voice back. All right. But I hear you thinking, our users are professionals. This does not perhaps apply to them. They have good reading skills. They know their topics. Maybe accessibility isn't as important in our B2B context. And you're probably right. Your users aren't elderly people struggling with an iPad. They're professionals. They work with data every day, perhaps. And they chose your tool with a reason. They were trained on it. They know what they're doing. And you're probably not entirely wrong. But I would like to push back. Your tool maybe is also used by the person that you didn't have in mind when you built it. It's traveling. It gets screenshotted. It gets forwarded. It gets exported. It gets printed in grayscale. It gets opened by people who weren't trained on it, people under pressure, people who don't have your mental model of what the scores mean, for example. And none of these people are edge cases. They are the everyday reality of how these types of tools actually get used in organizations. And for every one of them, a visualization that assumes fluency, patience, a good screen might be already failing. So this could be situational impairment, not a permanent condition, but a mismatch between what we try to achieve, what we think who we think the user is, and who it actually is. So try to keep in mind, you are not your audience, which is another way of looking at it. You're maybe projecting yourself as the audience of your tool. So 2 more statistics to challenge this even further. Even among professionals, digital fluency varies enormously. So 4 in 10 EU citizens lack basic digital skills. These are numbers from last year. And 1 in 12 men globally have a color vision deficiency, which means they have trouble distinguishing colors. So, and that's a lot of people to be clear. So the point I want to make is not to redesign your tool for the elderly or the visually impaired as a separate project, but to start designing for these constraints produce a better tool for everyone. When you create new content or visualizations or data or a tool, do so with the accessibility in mind from the start. Also designed for the tech-savvy people, also designed for the people under high stress with sun shining on their screen, for the older users, for people with a disability. So I'm not saying designed for people with disabilities only. On the contrary, I'm saying try to keep everyone in mind. So have inclusion and accessibility by design. It will help the expert user as well on a bad day as much as it will help the user who needs it most. And this is what you could call the curb cut effect. That's a name for the phenomenon that I just described. Curb cuts are these sloped cuts built into pavement at street crossings, initially designed for wheelchair users, but nowadays everyone uses those: cyclists, delivery workers with trolleys, parents with strollers, elderly people with walking frames, travelers with suitcases. It wasn't designed for these people, but it turns out that removing a barrier for one person made the life for everyone easier. There are more examples in digital tools as well. Captions on videos, for example, or on audio, initially meant for people with hearing impairments, but nowadays everyone uses them on the phone, in the train, on a noisy office, in a language that you're still learning. Spell checkers, autocorrect and autocomplete features are another example. Text-to-speech, initially meant for people with dyslexia, for example, having a hard time typing. Now it can be a mainstream productivity tool for people who prefer to consume content while doing something else, for example. And the pattern is always the same. You solve for the hardest constraint, but in doing so, you raise the floor for everyone. And I would like to keep this in mind when you're designing and working on your tools. So I would like to highlight 4 common pitfalls that can systematic blind spots that happen often in data-heavy tools. And if you've already got all of these covered, then genuinely well done. You can spend the next few minutes chilling and feeling smug while everyone else takes notes. But in my experience, most tools have at least one of these hiding somewhere, and also the tools that we create. But it's these are the easiest thing to miss when you're close to the product and you know the data inside out. So yeah, no judgment, simply a way of hoping to make something better. The first one would be poor use of color. So let's start with the most common one, and I think also the most easy one to fix. Most risk tools, for example, run on red, amber, green. It's intuitive, it's easy to understand, but color vision deficiency affects, as I said before, a lot of people. 1 in 12 men have some form of color vision deficiency. And red-green is exactly the combination most of them have a hard time distinguishing. So a fix would be straightforward. Never let color be the only thing carrying the meaning. Add a text label, high risk, medium risk, low risk. Add an icon, add a pattern to discern the meaning of something and not only use color. There is also a curb cut effect for this one. The text label you add for the colorblind user is also what helps the person who didn't read the legend, for example, next to the chart, or a person viewing a printout, for example, where the colors are not clear. It's not only red-green color contrast. There are actually established accessible palettes built specifically for data visualizations, tested across a wide range of different visualizations, which you can also use. Also try to keep in mind a minimum brightness contrast ratio between text and background. Here you can see in the poor example on the right, where the text of the graph, for example, is too bright. It's exaggerated, of course, but it's hard to read, for example. There are free contrast checker tools, and it takes 10 seconds to run, and it spots automatically where you are failing on contrast. And it doesn't stop there. If you print out your dashboard in grayscale, for example, then the issue becomes very apparent. Or if you open it on a cheap monitor, I don't even know if I'm sharing my screen now. if the colors are coming up right. Maybe it's even worse. So again, you cannot discern what was high risk or low risk. It's simply impossible to understand the graph now because it's grayscale. So in each of these situations, color alone is no longer doing the job. Here is an example or a suggestion. You can try on your own visualizations or on your own tools to simulate a color vision impairment. There are a lot of tools available for this to see what your tool looks like when you have a deficiency. And then, yeah, here are some examples of different types of color vision deficiencies. Deuteronom, I have a hard time pronouncing that, but 2.7% of men, I believe, have this condition. So conveying your meaning in other ways, even in other sectors, a toy maker, Mattel, you probably all know one of these games, but they did the same thing. They aimed to make 80% of their games accessible to players with color blindness. And you can also see here, a person with perfect color vision is not hindered by this. On the contrary, it even helps that, for example, if you're playing Uno, that you can see the shapes instead of the colors if you're in a low light environment, for example. So always check your design on color contrast mistakes. Here are a few tools you can use to do this. And there are like hundreds of tools like this available. The second issue that comes up a lot is charts with or without alternative context and text. And those charts get exported, printed, and there is sometimes missing a plain language summary. And so using plain language actionable titles, and this is also what Thomas was already explaining, so I will not go into too much detail here. Explain what the chart shows and what the viewer should focus on in the title and in the description. Here you can see a good example for to be clear, where the title of the chart says what to focus on and what the story is behind the data, and not just simply saying what the data is. So providing a caption or a summary to provide context is always beneficial. And a third thing, which is more behind the screens, but equally as important, to provide explanatory alt text, which is alternative text for screen readers, but also for AI, which is becoming more and more important as a valuable alternative. So literally providing a textual alternative to an image. And a good alt text should always be added to your data visualizations. Sometimes it can be a description, a text basically saying what the story is or what's important in a graph. But if you make one for a specific graph, this could be a possibility where you identify the chart type, not just saying this is a chart, but saying what the chart type is. For example, a line chart, state what the axes are and what's being displayed on them. A line chart of the share of renewable energy in EU member states, and so on. Lead with the key findings, which are also highlighted in the chart. For example, Sweden leading well above the EU average and Ireland sitting at the bottom. And acknowledge what's also in the background, which is still there, but less important. Also acknowledge it and note any trends. So for example, that all countries are showing an upward trend over the period, and also credit the source in your alt text. A third issue that's often coming up is that a tool or a dashboard specifically is designed for the analyst, but not for the decision maker, where you have a lot of jargon, acronyms, very hyper-specific information on a dashboard, which becomes very hard to understand for other people who might be in the room or who you're trying to convince. So technically, this dashboard could be super good, super correct. The data is there, but the tool has failed the user completely, not because of a bug, but because of an assumption that the person reading it shares the same mental model as the person who built it. So this is not just a an accessibility an accessibility problem for non-expert users. It's an adoption problem, and yeah, it lowers the trust in the tool if you do not understand what's there. So this is a reworked fake version of the previous one, where you actually try to show where action is required. For example, a plain language label alongside every score, not just saying the number, but also saying what it means. Is it high? Is it low? Does it require review? Something that works without a legend next to it. And the second one, what should the user do with the information, like reviewing the suppliers who have been low scores, for example. And again, here the curb cut applies. The plain language label you add for someone, for the procurement officer who doesn't know your scoring system, is the same label that helps a very experienced analyst still who's skimming at speed and he doesn't have time to decode the number. And most importantly, even try to test with non-experts. Try to talk to your users, perform user research, challenge your own assumptions. It's useful in every phase of the design process, and it can take different forms. It can be interviews, it can be just analytics data of your tool, trying to understand where people are dropping out, where they are leaving, and work from there. Take an empathy bath. The fourth issue I'd like to focus on is the issue of cognitive overload. I made a very exaggerated fictional example here without any visual hierarchy. It's less about accessibility in general, but more about a universal failure that affects every single user of a data-heavy tool. It happens when an interface asks the brain just simply to do too much at once. Too many indicators. You need a 10-hour workshop to understand everything that's on this screen. And even for users with cognitive disabilities or concentration difficulties or memory impairments, or simply having a bad night's sleep before using the tool, it becomes very uncomfortable. It's just a wall of information. So again, this can be cleaned up. It's not about removing information, but it's about hierarchy. It's about sequence. It's about grouping information, and try to figure out what the single most important thing is on the screen. Also coming back to what Thomas said earlier about guiding the viewer, the reader, the user, and make them giving them step by step, having them take it step by step, basically. Yeah. And everything else that's not as important, make it secondary, but don't let it compete with the main message you're trying to convey. So I promised you to give you some extra tips on what you can do now. Of course, taking accessibility into account, the best time to start was during the build of your tool. The second best time is to do it now when it's already built. There is a quick test you can do, and it brings everything together in a practical thing you can try right now or tomorrow or whenever you like it, and you don't need any budget for it or an accessibility audit or a developer. You just pick a chart or a visual or a data in your tool, as complex or as simple as you want, and you cover it, you put your hand over it, you minimize it, whatever works, and write in one sentence what explains what the chart shows and what the user should do next. Not what the data is about, but what it means and what follows from it. And if you can write that sentence clearly and quickly, your chart is doing its job. If you're struggling yourself, if you want to add caveats or explain the scoring methodology or say it depends on who is viewing, or then I think there is something wrong or the chart isn't finished yet. The confusion you will feel when writing the sentence is the confusion your users will feel when they're looking at the visual. So here we have 3 examples of basically what could be the same visual. The first one is bad because it has no meaning or no action. It has a data description only. The second one is better. It explains the meaning, what you would be seeing in the data, but there are no next steps, no action suggested. And the third one is good because it explains meaning and action, and it should work ideally for every user of every level. I'd like to wrap up my presentation because I've spent most of the presentation making a design quality argument. Accessibility makes your tool work better for more people in more situations. And I believe that's true, and I hope you do too by now. But I want to close with a more practical argument, because the question is not simply about, is it the right thing to do, but also, is it something we have to do? And as of last year, the European Accessibility Act is in effect since 2025. It came into force across all EU member states, and it covers digital products and services. So mandatory accessibility of digital products and services. Worth noting, in a B2B, in a B2C context, this is the case, not necessarily in a B2B context. So if your tool is used by public users operating in the EU, this act could apply to your tool. The details of the act are very complex and worthy of another presentation in itself. And I don't have the time for that, so I won't elaborate on it further. But the main thing I want to, or what I want you to take home is that accessibility is becoming a legal baseline and not simply a best practice. So not the right thing to do, but something you will have to do. And enforcement and auditing has already started in a lot of member states of the EU. So the direction of travel is set and it's moving fast. I want to leave you with two great sources. The first one, let's start with the one on the right about the European Accessibility Act. There is a QR code on screen which you can scan to go to all the information and see whether your tool or product is covered in the act or not. On the left, there is a very, very, very good source also by the Europa data team on data visualization. And there's a lot of things covered there about design principles, color typography, storytelling, text annotations, pitfalls through statistics, also in chart types, which to use, which not to use, run away from pie charts, and et cetera, et cetera. But also accessibility plays a big part of their guide, which is a good thing. So scan the QR codes on screen right now to go to the tools. I'd like to wrap up with an upcoming workshop that we have planned in the context of Diligence. At the end of the year, the dates have to be confirmed, but you will be invited through email on 2 tool provider workshops in our office in Leuven, so in person. 2 day-long workshops, I believe. Tim, you can correct me later if I'm wrong. The first workshop will allow you to dive deeper into your users' needs and map out their pains and gains together. We have a lot of frameworks available and would like to explore them together. And in the second workshop, we'll move on from understanding your user to actual actionable elements and how to go from there. Voila, that's the end. We have a few minutes left for any questions or tips to share or anything else that we didn't cover yet.
Yes, thank you very much, Anton, and also, again, thank you, Thomas, for your earlier presentation. I think what we've tried to do here is go from sort of a more general framework of what can data do, what can data, how you can use data to tell a story, to make it relatable, but also actionable. Again, the data itself or the reports that we are presenting are not your end goal, I would hope. It's the actions that people and organizations take upon them. And then going a little bit more into the practical side of things with Anton's presentation on accessibility. And I would like to open up the floor to people. I see there's no questions so far in the chat, but if you have a very specific question on your own tool you would like to have our experts have a look at, please do speak up, and we will be happy to look into that. And if nobody has a question, I can ask a question for sure. I'll start them off. I think, Thomas, you mentioned a few times the translation from obviously your more journalistic and very fast-paced context and the translation or the translatability to more general or static tools. If you would have to give one design principle from the newsroom that due diligence tool providers should steal, which one would it be?
Anton, when he mentioned like make graph articles as directly as possible, I think that's one of the main pitfalls that I still see in a lot of, let's say, government dashboards, corporate dashboards, and so forth, where it signals that you're mostly targeting a pro user if you don't have a straightforward title for a graph. So that's already one point. And I know that technically it's a lot harder. Like if you do it in a static graph, it's quite easy. But if you have a dashboard, then it takes also some statistical and data-driven work in order to keep your, let's say, if a dashboard is meant to be up to date all the time, that means that having a clear title also takes a lot of technical work in order to have it sharply and correctly at all times. But I think even like for us, we created articles that are custom made for, let's say, each municipality in Belgium. We really did the work in order to have a separate title for each separate municipality. And those are things that really make a big difference for both tools, dashboards, and so forth. So I think everything that applies to making a graph communicate better, having clear titles, having sharper annotations, having the correct metadata, is I think the most important job, and all things come from there. Because if you know what a chart communicates, then you'll automatically start thinking about, okay, but is this the right order of the graphs? How does the title of one graph interact with the title of the second graph, and so forth? So I think that's something that gets the conversation going.
All right, thank you. I know obviously these are sort of very quick questions, and we can't go into details too much here, but Anton's also a similar sort of question for you. I think you've mentioned it slightly, but if I've been inspired by your talks, where do I start? What is the first thing that I do? Is the one piece of advice you would give me to start looking at improving my tool?
I would really say look at the colors. Change your screen to grayscale and see what happens. That's basically a super quick thing, and you will realize immediately the problems that start to arise when you do it. And if you already got a lot of good contrast ratios in your tool, then that's very nice. But it's a relatively easy start there.
I see there are no other questions in the chat, so I think we'll leave it at this. We were only scheduled to go until 5, and we've gone slightly over. Apologies for that, but I think you will all agree that both Thomas and Anton were very much worth the extra few minutes in your busy schedules. Thank you very much for joining this Diligence Tool Provider workshop. I hope you will find more resources on the platform. And as Anton mentioned, there will be some tool provider maturity labs in the fall and the start of next year. With that, I wish you all a very pleasant evening. I hope wherever you are, it's as, I wanted to say enjoyable, but it's almost a little bit too hot in Belgium. Yes, have a lovely evening and the rest of your week. Bye-bye.